All right, let's get into this one. It's a classic story, really. A homeowner versus their HOA. But this time it's after a huge storm triggers a catastrophic flood. And trust me, this is more than just a story about water damage. It's a real-life detective story, you know? It's about decoding old blueprints, figuring out who's to blame, and what happens when our engineered world collides with the raw power of nature.
And it all kicks off with homeowner Deatta Pleasance. And these are her actual words describing that terrifying moment when she realized her property was just getting swamped. You can practically hear the panic in that quote as the water just keeps coming up, threatening everything.
So what caused all this chaos? Well, back in July of 2021, a monster storm just parked itself over the Pinecrest Lake community and dumped over 3 inches of rain in only a few hours. I mean, that's a total deluge. It completely overwhelmed everything in its path and set the stage for a huge legal fight over who exactly was responsible.
And that really is the central question here, isn't it? Was this flood the result of a faulty, neglected drainage system, which is what the homeowner claimed, or was this just an unavoidable act of God, a storm so massive that literally no system could have possibly stopped it? Let's dig in and see what the evidence says.
Okay, so first, let's break down the argument from the homeowner's perspective. For Ms. Pleasance, this was definitely not some random act of nature. She was absolutely convinced the problem was man-made and that her HOA was the one to blame. So she didn't just complain, she filed an official complaint with the state. And the accusation was incredibly specific. She said a culvert, which is basically a big drain pipe, in a common area that the HOA was responsible for, was broken or blocked. See, in her mind, this single point of failure was the reason the whole ditch backed up and sent water flooding onto her property.
And wow, this quote really gets to the heart of what she believed. To her, this wasn't some complicated engineering puzzle. It was just common sense. She was absolutely positive there was a huge, obvious flaw, a main drain that was just disconnected from the rest of the system.
And she was sure she had the proof. She went back and dug up the original construction plans from the 1980s, and there it was. A double line on the blueprint that she believed showed this critical, disconnected culvert. This was her smoking gun, the key piece of evidence that to her proved the system was flawed from the day it was built.
So, with an official complaint filed and this smoking gun on the table, the HOA knew they needed an expert opinion, and fast. So they brought in a civil engineer to do a totally independent investigation and get to the bottom of what really happened.
And that expert was Dr. Zachary Barlow. We're talking a senior civil engineer with a PhD. He was brought in to give a purely technical, unbiased look at the drainage system, those original plans, and everything that happened that day.
And he didn't mess around. His process was incredibly methodical. First, he reviewed those old 1980s designs. Then he went out to the site not once, but twice for inspections. He compared what was actually built to what was on the plans. And, this is so important, he analyzed the property's location using official FEMA flood maps. He was covering all the bases.
All right, now this is where the story takes a huge turn, because Dr. Barlow takes that smoking gun evidence, that double line on the blueprint, and puts it under an expert microscope. And what he finds completely flips the script on this entire case.
So this slide right here lays out the whole disagreement perfectly. On the left, you've got the homeowner's claim. That double line is a disconnected culvert. But on the right, you have the engineer's finding. He says, nope, that's not a culvert at all. It's just a standard hatch pattern, a drawing technique used on blueprints to show where the road is.
So how could he be so sure? Well, Dr. Barlow explained that on engineering plans, a real pipe or culvert has to have technical specs written on it, things like invert elevations, which mark the height and slope of the pipe. The double line Mrs. Pleasance pointed to had none of that. Meanwhile, all the other actual culverts on the plan were clearly marked.
But Dr. Barlow's investigation uncovered something else, something even bigger. He checked the official FEMA flood maps and found that the property was located smack dab in the middle of what's called a regulatory floodway. Now, this isn't just a regular floodplain. This is a high-risk zone specifically meant to channel deep, fast-moving water during a huge storm. Building there is risky.
And this finding was an absolute game changer. It meant that this house wasn't just near a flood zone, it was built directly inside one of the highest risk areas you can imagine. This piece of information completely changes the context for what happened that day.
Now, let's talk about the storm itself. The drainage system, which was built way back in the 80s, was designed to handle what engineers call a 50-year storm. That sounds impressive, but it just means a big storm that has about a 2% chance of happening in any given year.
But the storm that hit in 2021, that was classified as a 100-year storm, an event that was way bigger than the system was ever designed to handle.
And that led Dr. Barlow to this powerful, unavoidable conclusion. Given the sheer size of that 100-year storm and the fact that the house was built in a high-risk floodway, he said flooding wasn't just possible, it was expected. It didn't matter how perfect the culverts were. Under those conditions, that area was going to flood.
So, with all this evidence on the table, from the homeowner's personal story to the engineer's deep dive analysis, the case finally went before an administrative law judge to make the final call.
And on February 20th, 2024, after listening to all the testimony from everybody involved, the judge handed down the final decision that would settle this dispute once and for all.
And the verdict was clear and simple. The judge dismissed the homeowner's petition against the HOA entirely.
So why? Well, the judge's reasoning followed the engineer's testimony almost exactly. The key findings were: 1. The storm was just too massive for the system. 2. The house's location in that FEMA floodway made it incredibly vulnerable. And finally, the judge found that the HOA had done its job maintaining the system and that the system itself had been built correctly according to the original plans.
And this final quote from the judge's decision really says it all. This case wasn't really about a broken culvert or a negligent HOA. It was about a tragic, unfortunate reality. A home was built in a very high-risk location, and it got hit by a historic storm. In the eyes of the law, what happened that day was sadly inevitable.
But this whole case leaves us with a much bigger, more difficult question, doesn't it? As these so-called 100-year storms seem to happen more and more often, we're going to see more cases just like this, where our infrastructure is just overwhelmed. So when nature basically tears up the blueprint, who's responsible? Is it the homeowner? Is it the community that approved the plans decades ago? Or is it on all of us to completely rethink where and how we build in this new, more unpredictable world?